Hello, everybody. This is Chick Dabby. I'm at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We're a national resource center that provides training, technical assistance, and resources on several issues, including domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. I'm joined by my colleague, Shirley Luo, who will be also posing questions and monitoring the chat as we go. So to get started, I want to when we change the slides, I'm just going to say next, so that if there are people who are just on the phone, they can also know that we're on to the next slide. And as you can see on your screen, the PowerPoint is under you can download the PowerPoint if you haven't already under Files, and then there are several web links that are up. So thank you very much for your interest in this issue, and please feel free to let us know in the chat if you've worked with trafficking victims and survivors, or you are currently working with them and you have some experience in this area, or if you're new to the issue and this will be an introduction for you. So I have a lot of information to cover in the slides, so I'll be going a little over the speed limit here, and will be providing a lot of information and references. And before I get started with the PowerPoint and the information here, next slide, please. I want to really acknowledge the importance of all the learning that we have in the field that comes from survivors who speak out and who teach us as advocates what we need to know about trafficking and what we need to learn about it. So I really want to make clear what an important resource they are, and the expertise that they have that comes out of their own experiences as survivors of trafficking has been enormously important to the field. Next. So there will be 4 areas that I'll be addressing. There'll be definition and purposes, identifying survivors, trafficking and trauma-informed care, and lastly, I'll be talking about points of contact. Next. So as many of you know, there's been a fair amount of attention paid to trafficking, so I'm assuming that you're familiar with some of the very basic pieces and understanding and definitions of trafficking. So I want to just I will go through this section a little quickly. So this PowerPoint and this training is really focusing on understanding the trauma that comes from being trafficked, as well as and understanding that trauma is really connected to understanding the dynamics of trafficking, what is happening, who are the controllers, and what are the types of means they use. So as we know, the definition of trafficking includes actions, means, and purposes. And this very definition contains elements of trauma. So if we look at the types of actions that traffickers use, recruitment, harboring, transportation, the means particularly are laden with trauma, using threats, coercion, abduction, debt bondage, and then the purposes, labor in terms of labor trafficking. There's, of course, people are recruited and trafficked for industrial, agricultural, fishing, mining, construction, extraction sectors, and sexual exploitation includes street prostitution, escort services, pornography, internet-aided prostitution, strip clubs, massages, peep shows, etc. Some of the other purposes that occur around trafficking are organ removal or organ harvesting. These or fraudulent adoptions. These don't get a lot of there's not much information about them, and they don't often get publicized enough. But sometimes what we hear from anecdotally from the information is that when sex trafficking survivors age out, quote, age out of the system, then they sometimes, their organs are harvested. So the purpose of the trafficking can change also. And as you know, many of these purposes and means are fluid, so there might be coercion or just recruitment at the beginning, and then it can, then the means can create debt, or the purposes can change. You can be recruited for labor trafficking, and then the purpose can be changed for sex trafficking, or both. And the other the other purpose I want to point out is forced drug smuggling, where people are being trafficked to serve as drug mules and transport drugs across borders. Next. The definition of domestic minor sex trafficking is before you, and it refers to the commercial sexual exploitation of minors. And then it defines what commercial sex acts also refer to. So it's the exchange of anything for value exchanged for sex. Next, commercial sexual exploitation of children. So CSEC. So in the previous slide, you just saw the definition of domestic minor sex trafficking, or DMST. And DMST and CSEC are used interchangeably. They're interchangeable terms. Some people prefer to use one or the other. The definition of commercial sexual exploitation of children actually is a list of crimes that are that you see on your screen that are included there. So these are existing crimes, and there isn't a sort of separate definition around CSEC. What I want to point out for all of us as advocates is that some of these some issues on this list pose quandaries for us as advocates. So if you look at the issue of exploiting a minor through survival sex, which is the third bullet down, we know many from our work that survival sex is just that, it's survival. So when is something exploitation? When is something survival? Who understands it? Who defines it that way? How is it experienced? We know that these are part of the very complex context that we have to take in mind when doing our work. Next. So who are the traffickers? The traffickers are organized crime syndicates that can be international syndicates or local ones, and that includes street gangs, drug cartels, and typically syndicates with diversified portfolios. So these are big organized crime syndicates who run big trafficking operations, and they traffic in humans, drugs, and guns. Independently owned businesses can be involved in trafficking. Large third-party labor recruiters who bring, who serve as contractors or agents, and they provide labor for the different industries that use low-wage labor or exploit people who are trafficked here. And then the other group of traffickers can be community and family members. And so these can be people from a victim's own community, or people sort of mom and pop businesses. And often these folks, especially in international trafficking, they might have, the traffickers have more social or political status than the victims that they prey upon. Next. So who are the traffickers for domestic minor sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation? So this is important to understand, because as you'll see as we proceed, that there are who the controller is actually has an impact on how we would be thinking about our services, on how we would be understanding some of the traumas that survivors face and how we would consider collaboration strategies with other systems. So this is what we've learned very much from survivors of trafficking, and that there are multiple types of traffickers. So the first one, pimp-controlled, this is the one that people most commonly understand and are aware of. And here there's targeted recruitment, so some of the means and strategies that are used, targeted recruitment, grooming, turning out. So turning out refers to the point at which a traffic survivor, somebody who's been recruited and groomed, is then used, exploited, and has to, turn out at a strip club perhaps, or start seeing the pimp's, quote, friends and meeting them. So there's that, it's sort of the point where a survivor kind of crosses into the territory and the space of being exploited, sexually exploited, and abused. Family-controlled trafficking is more common than is traditionally understood, and the dynamics include, incest within the family, sexual abuse within the family, and often there's more trading and buying and selling, but there can be some trading. So if there's an uncle in the family who's selling drugs or cooking up meth, then the minor would be, traded. The sex with the minor child would be traded with the uncle who has the drugs. So there's more trading in family-controlled trafficking. And one of the excellent resources we have on understanding family-controlled trafficking is Elizabeth Corey and her website and her work, which is called Beating Trauma. So the next type of control are the intimate partner controlled. So this is where an individual, intimate partner, a husband or a boyfriend, and in a heterosexual or same-sex relationship, is pimping out their partner and forcing them to have sex and forcing them to prostitute themselves. So this can often look like domestic violence, and in our work. So we may not be very quick to identify it as trafficking, because of course the dynamics of domestic violence and sexual violence and trafficking then intersect here. In gang-controlled trafficking, there can be two types of gang recruitment. One is by girls who are in girl gangs and female gangs, and the other can be by girls and young adults who are girlfriends in male gangs. So they are connected to male gang members, and they recruit and control the individuals that they traffic into. That they traffic. In gang-controlled trafficking can be pretty violent, and the threats and blackmail also are elevated in gang-controlled trafficking. In crime syndicate-controlled trafficking, this is, as I mentioned earlier, big operations. There would be high levels of debt. So typically, people who come into the country or are trafficked owe a large debt to the trafficker that they are paying off. And these can be traffickers with diversified portfolios. The other groups that sort of enter into this picture are individuals who were victims of domestic minor sex trafficking, and they've now aged out and they become management. So they are they didn't originally do the recruitment and so on, but now they become the part of the trafficking operation. And lastly, facilitators and enablers. This refers to people who assist in trafficking populations. So facilitators are typically, somebody at the casino that opens the back door so individuals can, come in through there, or the taxi driver who knows how to take somebody, or the hotel desk clerk who also knows how to contact somebody who's, selling sex. And enablers refers to the same kind of purposes and the same kinds of strategies, but often enablers are more connected to family-controlled trafficking. Okay. Any particular questions around this? So I just want to say it's a little hard for me to follow the chat and stay focused on the presentation, but we will look at the chat afterwards, and we can, answer questions if that I might miss. So do keep in mind that the DMSDC sex traffickers can be quite wide-ranging, and it can also change. So one of the things that was happening in the Bakken region, where there was a lot of fracking and, quote, the man camps were there, what people were seeing is initially there was pimp-controlled trafficking, and then as the crime syndicates who were bringing in drugs to those areas, to the camps, to the work camps, as they saw how lucrative the sex trafficking was, then they started engaging in sex trafficking. So what started out as pimp-controlled trafficking then became crime syndicate-controlled trafficking. Okay, next. So what are the means that traffickers use? Of course, they use violence, which includes, physical and sexual violence, threats to victims and to her or his family members in their home countries or in the U.S. They also often, if violence is not used against a particular individual, others are forced to watch the violence that's meted out by, against other women in what's referred to as the stable. So there's a lot of vocabulary around domestic trafficking that is important to know if you're doing this work, and, important to kind of learn about. So so violence includes being forced to watch violence, and that, of course, sends a chilling message about what can happen to others. Poverty is a big lever that is used by traffickers, and where a lot of debts are called in. And in domestic trafficking, there are daily quotas that prostituted children and adults have to bring in. So depending on the regions where you work and where you're located, the quota can be, $500 a night that somebody has to bring in, or $300, etc. And so it's this issue of debts is something I'll be referring to also, because it is connected to part of our understanding of what the sources of trauma are. Traffickers also, of course, use coercion, and coercion to both recruit and to turn out people. But there's also the issue of substance use coercion, where traffickers who might then get the women and boys in their group, they would be coercing them into using drugs so that they get addicted, and they're using, so that the people they're victimizing for sex trafficking are also using substances. And the last means that I want to point to is the issue of vulnerability, and how traffickers have become so skilled at exploiting vulnerability. So typically where trafficking is so entrenched in exploiting poverty, it now is also very skilled at exploiting vulnerability. And here's something that comes from some comes from a write-up by a pimp that, if somebody wants love, give them love and become their boyfriend. If they need a place to live, give them shelter. If they're lonely, become their friend. And if they don't have a loving father, become their protector. If they are poor or have low self-esteem, sell them a dream or a life of status. I find this very chilling, very informative, and it actually shows the kind of subtlety, if you will, and the depth of how vulnerability can be exploited. And it's important for us to understand these because otherwise we only end up having a very black and white picture of how people are trapped in this cycle of abuse and being trafficked. Next. So moving to the second part of the presentation today, I'll be talking about identifying survivors. Next. So who is being victimized currently? And I'm mostly referring to the landscape of domestic trafficking, and there are some international trafficking. But what we are seeing is in the sphere of domestic trafficking that children, teens, and youth are all being trafficked. Adults, Native women and girls are particularly vulnerable. U.S. and foreign-born individuals are also being exploited, and then refugees, asylees, and immigrants, and some of who may not speak English, not have high levels of English fluency, and of course that increases their vulnerability and isolation. LGBTQ youth are part of the group that's victimized. Homeless youth, unaccompanied minors, these are asylees, so they're asylum seekers and refugees coming across the border because of conditions in their home countries that are quite violent, and so they're escaping those conditions. So when they come here, they can also be vulnerable. And people with disabilities, which also people who are deaf or hard of hearing can also be part of the group that's victimized. Are there any other groups that you know of in your work? So could you, if you do, please enter them into the chat. Okay, next. So I want to, this is a quote from Holly Austin Smith, who wrote a book called Walking Prey. And what I want to emphasize here is that a lot of times the images that are portrayed of trafficked individuals are of people in chains, huddled in corners. The terms modern-day slavery are used. And so many of the images associated with this are these, chained individuals. And I've heard from many survivors of trafficking that this is that they find these images extremely distressing and disturbing, and they don't feel connected to those images. Which is not to say that it isn't scary and that they are not, of course they feel trapped, but those images we have to be careful about. So I wanted to interject a note of caution about that. And Holly Austin Smith talks about when she first started publicly speaking about my experiences, I felt pressure to tell audiences that I was scared in order to satisfy their confusion about my compliance with the traffickers' demands. So that's another piece. I think that gives us an insight into how survivors of trafficking interact with helpers or systems personnel, and that they feel that parts of their story are expected of them, that they're expected to feel terribly scared, and that's why they complied. But as Holly points out, it's much more complex than that, that she felt stupid, duped, disappointed, apprehensive, but she wasn't cowering in a corner as many images of trafficking convey. Of course, people are scared, and of course it is scary, so this is not to deny that, but I think the complexity that she points out to us is important to consider. Next. So I just noticed in the chat when I asked about who else was being trafficked, there were a couple of points made there. Women from drug cartels. Yeah, that's a good point, because sometimes the women, that male partners are connected to drug cartels, and if anything happens to the male partner, that partner is arrested or even killed by the cartel, then the woman is very vulnerable, and because she's going to have some amount of information about the cartel or who the traffickers are. So that's an excellent point. Thank you. And then the other point that was made, sometimes it's people who are protecting drug-addicted parents. So thank you for that. Moving on to, here are some tips for identifying domestic minor sex trafficking survivors. So dressing that is not age appropriate or not appropriate, or to the event that they're at, or to the weather. And we often hear about survivors saying, I was a 9-year-old dressed like an 18-year-old coming in and out of this hotel lobby every evening because my pimp sat in the lobby, and nobody said a thing. Nobody seemed to notice that there was something going on. So I think, in many ways, it's important for us and for all of us, not just who work as advocates, but in terms of raising awareness about these issues, to try and understand the range of where trafficking operations occur. So they also occur in hotels, truck stops, at events and casinos. And sometimes in the casino part, there's also in the parking lots of these places, so in the parking lots of hotels and casinos, etc. One identifier is the way money is handled. So the pimp or the bottom may be handling all the money. And another indicator is that survivors are not handling any money, but they're using a lot of gift cards instead of money. So the pimps give them gift cards so they can buy things. And there are different ways that awareness is being raised. So apparently somebody was telling me how CVS has a way of tracking people who are using a lot of gift cards. So if you use up to like $500 of gift cards, they can sort of understand. It's a red flag that this person might be trafficked or is being coerced and doesn't have any cash, and they're just being given these gift cards. Now, I don't know what they do with that data, or if they use it to alert anybody, but that people are trying to figure out different ways to identify who's being victimized. Living conditions are another identifying factor. So they might be living in motels and cars, living with, quote, daddy or boyfriend. So these are names given to pimps, are often referred to as daddy or boyfriend. They often don't know many details of daily life. The local schools, the names of the city even may not be known to them. And sometimes, if you ask like what school, they'll say they're in high school. What school are they going to? They have no idea of the name, so they'll just say something like, oh, the local high school, So they're very unfamiliar with the geography of the area they're in because they're moved around so much. They might know the shopping mall because that's the place that they go to, that the traffickers take them to buy clothes, etc. And other, sign identifiers are connected to daily living, of course, that they might be very hungry, they have limited contacts in their phones, if they even have access to a phone. And there are health problems, and I'll come to the health problems in more detail later. So the dynamics of control in domestic minor sex trafficking can be subtle or very overt, including, of course, the use of violence. Okay, next. So in terms of identifying domestic minor sex DMST survivors who are trapped in family control trafficking, here are some tips for identifying them. One of the points that they all mention as adults is that sexual abuse is normalized early in a girl's life in the context of family control trafficking. So so that it's an identifier, but it's a difficult identifier to get disclosure on early when you're working with somebody. But there is that, so if you hear traces of sexual abuse or just sex being, early sex with children being normalized, that can be, that's an indicator or an identifier. The survivor or victim may not necessarily be homeless because she's in a family-controlled trafficking situation, and so she might be living, so she's most likely living in her home with parents, etc. And because of the trading that happens, she may also move around between other family members' homes. And her abuse and isolation may not be apparent. I say her because a large proportion of family control trafficking is with females, is where females are victimized. And Elizabeth Corey points out how family traffickers also invoke competition between siblings. So just as in pimp trafficking, you have siblings, you have individuals who are in the pimp stable. They're sort of they're made to kind of compete with each other as a further means of control and power. And in family trafficking, there's a similar dynamic, but the competition is invoked between siblings who are being trafficked. Parents may also be using or abusing drugs. Victims may claim that they are homeschooled, and which is a way of continuing their isolation. This is not to say that homeschooling is a problem or is connected to trafficking, but this might be one of the indicators. And family traffickers are often well known in the community, so they have some standing in their community, and they're not necessarily identified or known as traffickers. So again, that then makes the credibility of survivors harder because their family members are well-known community members. One of the dynamics of control are mostly subtle, and again, Elizabeth Corey refers to the sort of dynamic of brainwashing, and feels that many describes and talks about how, as a victim of family control trafficking, since she was a toddler, how that part of that brainwashing, which then normalizes sex, sexual abuse, etc., is part of the control mechanism in family control trafficking. Next. So identifying LGBTQ youth survivors, and this for this group, I think we are always faced, particularly with this group, we are faced with questions about some of this, whether the strategies that youth are using to survive, so are they using survival strategies or are they being exploited? So there is some debate about referring to the trafficking of LGBTQ youth. And given the levels of family rejection that they experience, many of them are kicked out of their homes, are homeless, are living on the streets. And so then they connect up to others who offer them protections or resources, and those are referred to as their chosen family. So the survival and the protections that they are looking for because they are kicked out of their streets or because kicked out of their homes or have run away from home because of their queer identity, the chosen family becomes protective of them. So the questions and the debate are, is this a situation where they're being exploited or whether they're being supported or finding some resources that help them survive on once they try to come off the streets. They may be one of the ways that they're exploited by traffickers is that they are used for sex trafficking as a way of obtaining funding to pay for their transition drugs. So the purposes can be slightly different here and may look different. And so that's why it's harder to connect that to trafficking. So if somebody's prostituting themselves or is being prostituted by traffickers, is it a matter of, and they're doing it to get transition drugs, it's often not clear to us as advocates how to understand that as exploitation or survival, or this is the only way they know how to get those drugs. And they, in the trafficking context, they are exploited by frequently contributing to the daily household expenses. So some survivors have said how they had to pay towards the electricity bill every day in this chosen family home. So the dynamics of control are much more subtle, and there is not that much, levels of violence are lower than in, say, gang control trafficking. Okay, next. And you know, as if any of you, please put in your tips or your identifiers based on your experience. I know there's a wealth of knowledge and expertise of people on this webinar and training, and we'd love to sort of to learn from you and so on. Okay. So identifying labor trafficking victims. Oh, I'm sorry. In the DMST trafficking, in the chat, people were talking about how the school officials might, be a way that because they're noticing new names, brand names, clothes, multiple phones, so they're seeing the products that somebody in the school is carrying or having with them, that might help them. That might be an indicator. Okay, so talking about some tips for identifying labor trafficking. The locations for labor trafficking can be family or mom and pop businesses and restaurants, farms, factories, construction, oil and gas extraction. And there are many types of farms, so not just, so horse farms in Kentucky. And so it's just important to try and understand what, if you're going to be working with labor trafficking or you're trying to identify that in your area, trying to look at what industries or what operations are there that might be using labor trafficked individuals. Okay. Another way, another identifier can be access to money. And so with labor trafficking, people carry very high levels of debt that they can never seem to pay off. or they're paying very high prices for everything. So even if they're working on a farm and they have to get tools or gloves or masks to protect them from pesticides, or that they're paying a lot of, they have to spend a lot on these things, and they have to pay for everything even though they are not earning much by way of wages, if anything at all. And the living conditions they might be living in migrant camps in very crowded quarters, sleeping in shifts. So there may be 20 people sleeping in a place or in a room which has like 5 beds, and so then they're sleeping in shifts. So these are some of the identifiers there: health problems, prolonged exposure, lack of protective clothing, industrial injuries that have just not been treated, and exhaustion from working very long days, 10 to 12 to 14, 16-hour days. And the dynamics of control in labor trafficking are more complex and not so direct. So because typically in labor trafficking there can be multiple layers of traffickers, and the victims are really dealing with those on the lowest rung of that. So it could be the person who's the foreman on the farm, but not really the people who are making money at the higher up in the hierarchy of trafficking. So those dynamics there are more complicated to. Well, they're more simple to identify, but there's more layers than in other types of trafficking. Okay. Next. So in terms of identifying locations and events, in terms of the work that we're trying to do as advocates, it's important for us to understand where does trafficking occur, and how would we then, direct our efforts at raising awareness, at devising interventions, etc. And so some locations that I've listed here are hotels, casinos, casino parking lots. And there's a distinction between the casinos and the casino parking lots, especially on native territories and native casinos. There are jurisdictional issues. So in the casino, the tribe has jurisdiction. In the parking lot, it's not so clear that the tribe has jurisdiction. So somebody may bring the trafficked individuals might be brought to the parking lot instead of the casino, depending on jurisdiction issues, depending on where the facilitators are to help them, etc. And similarly, in hotels, especially hotels in tourist resort towns where there's a lot of tourist traffic, there can be a fair amount of pimp controlled and some family controlled trafficking that's happening there. So truck stops along major freeway corridors are also very significant locations. So the states where you do have major freeway corridors, it's important to think about that. And with the truck stops, the Truckers Against Trafficking has been a group that's come together, and they're getting training on identifying and assisting, how to assist young girls and young women and adults that they see at these truck stops who are being trafficked, and how to provide help to them, etc. So there's been some organizing among truckers to address the issue. And similarly with hotels, actually, hotels and casinos, they've also in some locations are receiving training on identifying who is being trafficked, and then coming up with ways to work with with advocates and other system personnel to come up with interventions. Urban areas on construction sites, so that's where you may have labor trafficking of the people who are working on the construction sites, but this is a site where prostituted girls and women or sex trafficking victims will be brought to these construction sites. And similar, they will be brought to the housing camps for migrant labor in rural areas. So again, the laborers might be trafficked as well as the individuals that are brought there by the sex traffickers. Tribal lands and native reservations. Again, there are very few resources in these places on native reservations and in tribal lands, and there are high rates of trafficking because of jurisdictional issues. Traffickers can take advantage of the jurisdictional issues, and there's increased vulnerability to exploitation. Ships and ports, so places like Minnesota, there can be trafficking on the ships, so the selling of sex happens on those ships, and again, there's the sort of jurisdictional advantages for the traffickers because there aren't really police on those ships, and there may be port police, but they're not the local city police or the county or the district police over there. So that's another area to be aware of. What was known as man camps in the oil and gas extraction industries. These camps are not called that way anymore, but they are very evocative and tell us about the sort of living conditions where you had high numbers of workers coming to these areas to be employed in fracking, oil and gas extraction, and then there was a lot of sex trafficking that was happening in those areas and regions, and still is. So major events, state fairs, sporting events, gun expos, rallies, like there's the motorcycle rally in Sturgis. In Arizona, they have like a festival for hot air balloons. So there are specific kind of big events, not just sporting events, that can happen in different states, and it's important to be aware of those in terms of being able to identify what the locations for trafficking are in your state. Backpage.com is well known for internet-assisted trafficking, and there are many sting operations that happen where the federal agents or the local police will do a sting operation on Backpage, so they'll put up a fake ad on Backpage.com, and then what happens is that they get so many responses that they can't really do anything further, so then they pull down the sting operation. But they're using that to arrest buyers, and which is the approach that is strongly, which is the much more important approach than arresting victims, of course. So in the chat, please feel free to tell us what some of the other locations might be. Somebody put in nail salons, and what rallies or events are in your state that are state-specific. That would be helpful. So next slide. So some cautions about all this knowledge and information and learning that we're getting about trafficking. The danger there, or the problem there, is that everybody wants to identify every single detail about what's happening. And so what I want to emphasize, which is what we're learning as advocates, that we really need to be sure that we see screening, intake, and assessment as three separate steps. We don't need to do all of it in the first encounter. And that the purpose of the screening is to be sure that we can identify the services that are needed and make the appropriate referrals. But we don't need at that screening level to find out all the details of who was the trafficker, how did you get trapped, what happened, how were you turned out, when was the first time, all that information. And many of us in the field are raising this issue because what we're seeing is the attempt to kind of get a lot of information to force disclosure very early on. And we need to be careful to avoid re-traumatization. Next. So now we go to section 3, and this is on trauma and trauma-informed care. So understanding the root causes of sex trafficking is important in our analysis about trauma. And a broader analysis is also important rather than only just looking at what happens in a particular event or to a particular survivor. As we know from some of the work that's being done on this issue and what survivors are telling us, there's a lot of exploitation of female vulnerability and of poverty. That's one of the root causes. Male demands and expectations for commodified sex, that they can buy sex. So the extent of male demand drives a lot of sex trafficking. Trends among buyers, paying higher prices for sex with young girls, paying for child pornography. So there are many kinds of ways that commodified sex, so demand is driving supply, of course, and it's really critical in our analysis that we keep that central to our understanding. Predation and impunity, there is a nexus of mostly predatory behavior and impunity, and often this is seen as been normalized. This is kind of normal masculinity, and male entitlement is part of this normal masculinity. Of course, there's a lot of activism happening right now around the Me Too movement and Time's Up, where people are saying, no, this is not normal masculinity, and if this is normal masculinity, it's toxic. So I think there's been a lot of awareness being raised about predatory behavior and how it impacts all of us. Money is certainly one of the root causes. It's lucrative, and it's also for survivors. It's a source of income. People need the money because they may have a sister who's very sick and needs medications that are really expensive that they can't get otherwise. So there are many reasons that survivors also get trapped and are part of this landscape. And then, of course, in understanding root causes, we have to turn to the question about gender oppression and how the culture of violence that we all live in, the culture of sexism, how that normalizes objectifying, the objectification of female bodies, and it normalizes the abuses of women and girls and vulnerability. And speaking of gender oppression, I just want to show you the work we've done at the Asian Pacific Institute on gender-based violence. And we've always taken this analytic approach to talk about violence over the life course, and not only as something happening suddenly to somebody at some stage. And you're not going to be able to read all the items on this, but what we are trying to show is that there's vulnerability and exposure across the lifetime, and that has a huge impact on all of us in society. Next, please. So this exposure to gender-based violence over the life causes is also a huge contributor to the trauma that we are seeing in our own lives and in other people's lives. What the lifetime spiral of gender violence shows is the historical nature of gender violence, and that it's not accidental, so it's not about having bad luck with men or being in the wrong place at the wrong time only. It's not like a one-time incident, but there's a history to oppression based on gender. And the spiral also illustrates the types of abuses girls and women are vulnerable to, and that they experience at different stages, and that there are a range of perpetrators located across the life course. So in terms of the vulnerability, I just want to point out that there may not be, there are people, of course, who are not exposed or clearly victimized, but they're exposed to the abuse. So if you're growing up in a home and you know your sister is being molested in the home, that increases your vulnerability. It affects you. It affects your trauma, and it affects other, family members in the home. So it's not direct victimization that just creates vulnerability and trauma, but also being in that context. And there's much more information on the lifetime spiral on our website, as Shirley has pointed out in the chat. Next. So here I want to just talk a little bit about some of the trauma related to help, how some of the issues that affect trauma in trafficking, for trafficking survivors. So the first one was gender-based violence and exposure to that. The second is the trauma that's related to help seeking. There's a lot of information, anecdotal and specific research, that shows that past experiences of help seeking influence current attempts, and many people have negative experiences of help seeking. So I've just pointed out a few of them here. So again, with trafficking, there are multiple types of abuses and abusers. So that just shrinks the potential group of helpers. It internalizes the devaluation even deeper. So it's not just one person telling you that you, quote, deserve this or you're worthless, but the multiple abusers messaging that. And so, survivors then also internalize that devaluation even more deeply. So some of these conditions and contexts then affect how help-seeking is experienced, and many of us, as I said, many people have negative experiences of help-seeking. Next. So by the time individuals come to our programs, and by the time survivors are there, they've already had both negative histories of abuse and of help-seeking. And these can start early in the life course, and they're enduring repeated victimization on a daily basis. So again, their experiences of help-seeking can, are more negative because of the rate of harm that's been happening. And if we go to the next slide, I think, again, quoting from Holly Austin Smith, we can see how she describes her experience when she sought help, and this part of the text clearly indicates when she says, many victims have been in circumstances where adults have consistently let them down, and they are especially unlikely to share prior sexual activity. One of the things we hear a lot is that trafficking survivors are consistently, by advocates, by systems personnel, asked how many men they had to have sex with. And it's a question that's kind of, it's a horrible question to be asking. And so I really want to caution us about when we, in our interventions, how do we think about this stuff? So we do not ask people how many men have they been forced to have sex with, and this kind of forced disclosure, or this adds to the kind of negative help-seeking experience. Next. So the other thing that influences the trauma that trafficking survivors are exposed to, this slide just presents the different types of trauma. As most of you know, our understanding of trauma has become quite complex, so we don't just think of trauma as sort of PTSD, but we understand chronic, historical trauma, insidious trauma, all the different types of trauma that that come from different directions, from different levels of exposure to oppression and abuse. So next, so typically just for a moment, so then those were the typical types of trauma. And for trafficking survivors, what I want to point out is there's sexual abuse over the life course, which of course, as we know from our work on sexual violence, starts early. Debt is an important source of trauma, and it's often an overlooked issue. So when, for instance, there's a raid or a sting on a massage parlor and everybody is then moved out of the massage parlor, those women still owe a debt to the trafficker, and now they have no means of paying that debt. So in our work of advocacy, of course, we're thinking about housing and employment and safety, and but the issue of debt and unpaid debt and the danger it poses to that person or to their family is a critical source of trauma to attend to with survivors. Of course, other sources of trauma include repeated rape by buyers, physical violence by traffickers, being undernourished, cold, sleep deprived is a big source of trauma. Seeing tattoos, so many pimps tattoo the girls and boys that they're exploiting, and so seeing those tattoos even when people are out of the life, it's a daily reminder of who owns you or owned you and used you. And then Elizabeth Corey talks in terms of family control trafficking about being in a constant state of upheaval. So in the home, there's this constant kind of chaos, which allows for constant control and therefore constant trauma. And it keeps victims in fight, flight, and freeze mode because there's this kind of chaos that's operating. And of course, the trauma differs given the different types of controllers. So as I said earlier, gang control trafficking can be pretty violent, and less so than family control trafficking. So it's the dynamics of control that then affect the dynamics and the types of trauma that survivors experience. Next. And we often hear from systems, the expectation that somebody is, there are a lot of systems expectations about what a typical victim looks like or how a typical victim quote, typical victim responds to help being offered. And it's really important for us to understand as advocates which of these responses are survival strategies, and if all of them can be survival strategies. So the typical thing is fight or flight. So people want to know, well, couldn't you leave? Why didn't you run away? Couldn't you have walked for help somewhere, etc.? But as we know in our work, that freezing is much more is often the most common response, and so people don't just run away because they're standing alone on a corner and could walk away. So again, which of these strategies that survivors use are protective, and survivors are attached to their abuser. Just as in domestic violence, we see survivors attached to their abusers. They can, when people are silent, that can be self-protective. To us, it may look like they're protecting their pimp, and they are protecting their pimp and their family, but it can also be self-protective. When survivors deny or retract statements, it's a way for them to have control over the process. When they're overlooking injuries, systems personnel might feel like, well, how come you didn't notice this, or how come you didn't know that your burns were getting infected, or that you have a urinary tract infection? Often there's a lot of ignorance and shame about one's body, so people are not overlooking their injuries or denying their injuries. They just don't understand the depth of what's happening, the extent of what's happening. Not disclosing their history. Again, we have to be careful of not putting survivors in a situation where they are where we're forcing disclosure or encouraging disclosure very early on in the process when the survivor is not yet ready. And of course, typically when survivors that we're helping are angry with us, with helpers and with advocates, we understand that it's a survival strategy. It's safer than being angry at their abuser. These are just a few points. Of course, there's much more complicated understanding about these issues and how survivors employ survival strategies to protect themselves. Next. So this is a very basic slide about trauma-informed care approaches, and I'll refer to them as we talk about points of contact. The important point here is to understand our collective kind of philosophical and guiding principle that a trauma-informed approach means asking in the spirit of inquiry and empathy and care, asking what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. And that stance gives us much more information, creates a better environment for advocacy, for healing, for support, and for strengthening relationships between systems and between survivors and advocates. Next. So now to the points of contact, and next. And what I want to say about the points of contact, there's a lot of information on these PowerPoint slides, and what I'm going to do is just focus on a few highlights and main points. There are many details that are in our TA brief on these different areas and points of contact. And so before I talk about the different points of contact, I just want to emphasize that one of the issues around trafficking is that the danger levels are different than when they are with domestic violence, where there's one abuser looking for one survivor, or threatening one person, so it's interpersonal. But in trafficking, the dynamics, as we saw, are quite different, and so the levels of danger do need to be taken into consideration in our trauma-informed advocacy. The levels of danger are affected by the complexity of a case. I'm sorry I'm using clinical and legal language here, but that is how the systems view these situations. It also depends on the stage at which survivors may escape. So if there are a number of survivors in a group in labor trafficking or sex trafficking, international victims, if they, if 3 or 4 of them, quote, escape a situation, then it can put all the others who are still trapped in danger. And so they might be trying to protect the others who didn't escape from that situation. So the stage of the investigation, there's obviously, attempts to prosecute traffickers, to find out, to break these rings, and so on. So the stage and the role in the investigation affects somebody's danger levels. There can be breaks in confidentiality because there are multiple systems involvement. Type of traffickers controlling the operation, of course, lends itself to danger levels and to estimating them. And then the extent of the debt. So if the victim or the survivor owes a large debt to the traffickers, that puts her or him in greater danger. And former victims who have become middle management or traffickers are not properly identified as such, so they may be seen as others, as a group of survivors, and that also then affects the danger. Next. So the first point of contact are raids and sting operations. So what I mean by points of contact, I'm just trying to go through the different steps where survivors come into contact with systems or advocates, law enforcement systems, other kinds of first responders, and so on. So one of the considerations under when local police carry out a raid or a sting operation, it's important to be able to identify and sort through the victims. And that might be difficult to do because most survivors are coached to lie by their traffickers and to not tell the truth. Some are former survivor victims who have now become traffickers, and some have also broken with the last set of controls of trafficking and have willingly returned to sex work, and they're not there as victims. So there's a complex collection of factors that assist us in identifying and sorting survivors from traffickers. Next. So in each of these points of contact, I raise a consideration, there are recommendations, and then there's tips about being trauma-informed. So continuing with rates, it's important when your local police are going to conduct a raid to partner with you as an advocacy organization so you can have some protocols for a coordinated response to go into effect immediately after the raid, to be able to sort out survivors from traffickers, and also to have interpreters for any non-English speaking survivors that are part of the pool of survivors. And being trauma-informed here, as I mentioned earlier, it means understanding how debt can be a source of trauma and identifying some of the triggers. So speaking to police, being in confined spaces, we may not think, we can clearly understand and relate to how speaking to police can be traumatic and can be a trigger. But being in confined spaces, we may not have that much experience with. So many individuals who've been trafficked obviously have been, in very confined spaces, so that can be a trigger for them. And they may have very negative health-seeking experiences from systems or police in their home countries. Next point of contact that I'm going to talk about is arrest. And here the considerations that trafficked individuals might get arrested at the same time. And so it takes a lot of training and astute questioning by police officers to determine that they are not criminals. And on the whole, there's been a lot of work done on this area in many ways that first responders and law enforcement is being trained for systems improvements and being able to, not arresting survivors. This is more so that these system improvements are very clear when there are minors who are trafficked, and not so often or frequent when it's adults who are being trafficked. So there constantly needs to be a system fix around arrest and who gets arrested. The recommendation I want to point to is that sometimes when there's a raid carried out by law enforcement and then there's a series of arrests, programs come forward as try to encourage other unidentified victims to come forward. And if your program is going to do that, it's important to have a coordinated strategy with your police department, so you're not just suddenly connected up to victims coming forward, but that there's a sort of systems coordination that understands the implications of that. And the other recommendation I want to make is in terms of collaborating on these issues with arrest is that although with sex trafficking, there are better responses about understanding that they are victims and survivors and not criminals. When people are trafficked to engage in criminal behavior like selling drugs or because of their immigration status, they are undocumented. So these people should not be considered criminals just because of the purposes that they're being put to by their traffickers. Next. So being trauma-informed here, again, a quote from a survivor where she says, "No one talked to me as if I was a real person outside a criminal case." And so it's obviously important that we not do that? And by and large, we don't. But when we're working with systems, we might see them doing that. So we have to be alert to that. So being trauma-informed here is ensuring that we have ways to help victims and survivors feel that they're in control, and providing some clear information about the procedures, about the impact of their decisions and the choices that they have. It's important to use language that minors and those with limited English or lower education levels or literacy levels can understand. A lot of times there's very technical language that gets used in these early interactions and at these points of contact. So our role as advocates is to make sure people are understanding what is being said to them and what the impact of their decisions might be. It's important to help victims and survivors manage their feelings, offering respect and compassion because they are surrounded and they live in a climate of mistrust and fear. And it's important to understand that they are loyal to their traffickers and feel a lot of conflicting and contradictory emotions as well. So they're not just going to feel grateful for being, quote, rescued. Next point of contact is investigation and legal representation, and this may not affect, by and large, all the people that you work with in your agencies, but there are a whole set of responses that come in when there's prosecution involved on a case. And so one consideration there is that lawyers might be sent by traffickers to quote, represent the victims, but in fact they're representing the trafficker's interest. And so it may not be clear to the victims who are sitting in a jail cell or waiting to be released from there or get out of there that these lawyers are not there to represent them or protect their interests. And in terms of recommendations, the investigation process is extremely complicated. As we all know, any process in the criminal courts, civil procedures are daunting, confusing, baffling, and so it really takes a lot of work to prepare survivors about questioning and testifying during some of these procedures. And to understand how that is, part of can be also contribute to that trauma. So next slide. So there, being trauma-informed means, again, being able to understand the sources of trauma during this investigation phase where people feel conflicted loyalties to their trafficker. And sometimes that gets labeled as a sort of uncooperative witness. So these conflicts we have to be sure that we can understand them, convey to survivors that we understand these conflicts, and and then work with our systems partners on making sure that they understand that this isn't about being uncooperative witness, but that these are actual a result of the abuse and trauma that the person has endured. It's important to minimize re-traumatization because it's somewhat inevitable that survivors are going to have to recount their stories multiple times, and that, of course, as we know, can be a source of trauma. And providing information, we can provide information to survivors about the trauma triggers that they might experience during this process, especially when they are challenged on inconsistencies during the investigation, and it can just trigger for them memories of traffickers making them feel stupid or worthless. Next. At this point of contact, I'm talking about mostly domestic violence shelters, although, of course, there are other kinds of shelters, especially for runaway homeless youth. And one of the difficulties and one of the differences for domestic violence shelter programs in sheltering trafficking survivors is that there are multiple federal agencies and multiple agencies that can be involved in these cases, and that's often new to a domestic violence shelter. So there can be the federal prosecutor's office, the FBI if it's a interstate case, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, ICE. So these multiple agencies create a lot of need for coordination and confusion. And so the shelter location may not be confidential anymore because the federal prosecutor's office needs to come there to interview the survivor who is in the shelter. And the other consideration is that when traffic survivors are, especially if there's a group of them or so, or even individuals in a shelter, they don't often participate in all the activities of the shelter. So they might be expected to not discuss their case because there's ongoing investigation going on. So there can be resentment that they are seen as receiving special treatment, or if they're in danger from their traffickers, they don't go out of the shelter much to participate in all the programming that DV survivor residents participate in. So those conflicts can emerge in a domestic violence shelter. And one issue that comes up with shelters also is that domestic violence shelters are predicated. One of the main principles is voluntary stay. You don't force somebody to stay there. But when there's a trafficking investigation and so on going on, it's often the case that police officers or the prosecutor's office and so on, they have somebody staying in the shelter and they say, okay, I'm going to need them. This is a material witness. Make sure they don't leave the shelter or don't escape or don't walk out of there. And so there's often a very severe conflict about this voluntary stay fundamental principle and the requirement from other systems and the expectation that that person will be kept in the shelter. So just a quick recommendation is to be sure that there's a lead advocate who coordinates with all these systems. Next. And in terms of being trauma-informed, I would say it's important to build emotional safety because survivors will feel isolated in a domestic violence shelter. They may not identify with DV survivors. If there are other trafficked individuals housed with them, they may mistrust them. And so building that, addressing that need for emotional safety can be very important and significant for that person's healing and sense of then physical safety as well. And understanding the trauma, some of the victims have also been perpetrators. This is often the case in runaway youth shelters where you have youth who've run away from home or been thrown away from home, and they because of victimization. But then when they're in the shelter, they might be recruiting others for trafficking, or they may be abusing them. So the victim-perpetrator boundaries are blurred, and that understanding the trauma that is connected and central to that kind of blurring can be important in this work. Next. So this is the last point of contact I'm going to address here, which is healthcare systems. And what I want to point out are some of the kinds of health issues that might be presented and that many of us work in the field, work with healthcare programs. There's been a lot of awareness that's being done and training for healthcare providers to identify patients with a trafficking history or connection that are showing up in their programs and their clinics. And so I just wanted to raise our awareness about some of these issues. So hunger, dehydration, these are severe things, severe dehydration, malnutrition because of poor food security. So especially if people are being moved constantly, exhaustion from working long hours, sleep deprivation, either from living on the streets or being homeless, and also from being transported around. So, once so they're being transported during the day, and they're sleeping in cars. So there's a lot of sleep deprivation that's affecting the health and mental health. Drug poisoning and tears for anal tears that appear for people who have been drug mule victims. Of course, rape, child sexual assault by buyers, pimps, and traffickers, multiple pregnancies, sometimes multiple abortions, HIV/AIDS, STIs. So these are more well-known, recognizable health identifiers. And then, gynecological OBGYN-related problems, pregnancy-related issues, and repeated use of Depo-Provera. Depo-Provera is used to space out your periods, and sometimes the traffickers force women to use it so that they can keep working and don't get their periods. And, lack of access to contraception, dental problems, next. So just continuing health and mental health issues, depression, anxiety, suicidality, cutting, exaggerated startle responses, substance abuse due to coercion by traffickers and pimps. People are also, survivors are talking about how buyers are showing up with drugs to pay, not cash. So then there's this other source of drugs that are coming, and of course substance abuse to self-medicate and deal with the trauma. And branding, so I just want to clarify that branding, I don't mean product recognition, I don't mean like brand names, but branding is where pimps, this is more typical to pimp control trafficking, are using like branding irons. So this is not a tattoo, this is like a branding iron used on cattle. And they're using that to on their victims, or on the women and girls in their, quote, stable. Urinary tract infections, because there are no toilets in agricultural for industrial workers, they can't take breaks. Of course, UTIs because of sexual abuse, and then multiple other injuries. Next. So some considerations here, just about medical records. In terms of I just want to point to the recommendation, it's really important to understand if you're working with a minor and they're getting medical help and have health issues, who the records belong to, who receives them, who owns them, who's giving consent, what is informed consent, especially for, informed consent for treatments, for evaluations, for tests. So it's a very complicated area, and sometimes it may be the prosecutor who's ordering that. Sometimes it may, so it's really critical in your systems coordination to understand who has access to all this material and what the implications of that are going to be. It's also important, it's critical actually, to have trained medical interpreters at all appointments and follow-up conversations. And if the person is getting counseling and needs an interpreter, then it also needs to be a trained interpreter who's in those counseling sessions. Okay, next. So part of being trauma-informed around these health and mental health issues is being sure that health providers who are untrained in screening for trafficking don't misdiagnose what the presenting problem is. And here are some examples. So malnutrition may be seen as an eating disorder and not understood as food insecurities. So or drug poisoning may be seen as this is a person who's using substances or is addicted, and a medical practitioner might miss the fact that this person has been used as a drug mule, and that's why they have drug poisoning. Multiple pregnancies, multiple abortions, HIV, STIs, these might be misdiagnosed as somebody who's ignorant of safe sex or is engaging in high-risk behavior. And so the practitioner miss the diagnosis and miss the dynamics of reproductive coercion and sexual assault that comes with trafficking. Repeated Depo-Provera use, again, that might be shrugged off as, oh, here's another teen who can't be bothered with her periods, but in fact it might be a prostituted teen who's being forced to take Depo-Provera. And then mislabeling things, thinking that sexual exploitation is dating violence, and so not understanding the full range of dynamics. So those were just some of the issues I wanted to point out about health and mental health. And next we go now to the last slide, which just actually lists some of the resources that we have. And yeah, so these are just for your information. There's a lot of resources on trafficking. There are a lot of people addressing this issue. We have a short condensed list of some resources. We're not trying to be able to, answer every question or information. The email address down there is how you can contact us. We are happy to do any training or provide technical assistance if you have a particular set of questions that you want to want us to provide information on, or provide technical assistance on to your team. That we're happy to do that, and to connect you with other resources if we can't answer it. And I want to thank everybody for all the great comments in the chat. There were some mention of things that we didn't bring up, like somebody mentioned that PTSD wasn't mentioned in the list. So yes, it's hard to be comprehensive and cover everything. I was trying, I think that is where our collective knowledge and experience is so useful, right? Because we have all this learning that we're doing, and it's great that that all of us can sort of contribute to our learning and understanding as we refine our advocacy strategies and understand how best to address this very complex and pretty horrible problem. So thank you, everybody, and for your participation. And this concludes the webinar.